Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. Today, I'm glad to have John back and talking about self-worth and Midsummer's Night Dream. Take it away, John.
Awesome. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody who is returning, and welcome for everybody who is new. As a brief preliminary note, for anybody who's new to this, what we typically do is talk about a self-improvement principle. And what I do is I find a work of fiction to provide, context or background for an example of this principle. So it's not necessarily a review of Midsummer Night's Dream or like a Shakespeare discussion per se. It's more so like this is an example of self-worth that I found in fiction, and we're going to use that. So this is going to work in three parts, I guess. First, we'll just summarize the relevant and necessary points from Shakespeare's play that we're going to talk about. Second, we're going to go into the principle of self-worth, some ideas around that and self-image, etc. And thirdly, finally, how we are to apply and benefit from the discussion today. So, Midsummer Night's Dream. It's very honestly chaotic in my experience from what I've learned about Shakespeare. This play is kind of all over the place. There's a lot of different themes, very whimsical, very imaginative, playful themes going on. So we're only going to look at like a certain part of Midsummer's Night Dream in terms of how it relates to self-worth. So what we have to know in terms of this discussion, there is a main character. There's a few we're going to talk about. The first is a man, I think his name is Aegeus, I think that's how you pronounce it. And he brings his daughter Hermia to the Duke of Athens named Theseus. And why he's bringing her to the Duke of Athens, he says, hey, my daughter is refusing to engage in this proposed marriage with this young man, Demetrius, who I picked for her. She doesn't like him. She likes this other guy, Lysander. Okay, so that's like the Duke of Athens, his job is, I guess, to reprimand her for doing that or whatever in this time period. They're not allowed to disobey the word of their father, whatever reason. So she's upset at this, and she decides with Lysander, her lover, to escape. They run away into the forest, and they're just like, oh, let's go to start a new life. Lysander has an aunt somewhere in the woods in this like exiled location. They're away from the laws of Athens and stuff like that. So like, okay, cool. It's a brilliant idea. Let's go just build our life in exile away from all this mess. But they escape, and then Demetrius, who was supposed to marry Hermia, actually follows the couple into the woods because he is still infatuated with Hermia. He's trying to break up this little predicament that they have planned going on. Also trailing along, there is this young woman named Helena who is following Demetrius, right? So you have this couple, Demetrius is following the couple, Helena is following Demetrius, okay? There's just like this little weird chain thing of going on where like one person is looking one way and they have an admirer, but they're not interested in the admirer kind of thing. So this little chain of people going out in the woods, right? So we have that little predicament. And simultaneously at the same time, there is this weird, again, I'm not going to go into the whole summary because we're going to get very, very obfuscated very quick. There's a character named Oberon, I think it's how you pronounce it, and Titania, which is the king and the queen of the fairies in the forest. Again, long story. They see this predicament of these four lovers that are chasing each other, etc. And Oberon, who is the king of fairies, has a servant in his arsenal named Puck. And what Puck does is he goes to extract some certain like nectar out of this flower. And what this nectar does is when you put it on somebody's eyes when they're sleeping, they immediately become enamored and infatuated with and fall in love with the first being that they see. So that's something they're working on the side to betray the queen of the fairies. That's something they're working on. But they say, hey, maybe I can step in and intervene and put this, potion, put a spell on Demetrius to make him love Helena, and then there's two couples, right? So everything would be perfect. It would have the first couple that ran away, and then they would turn around Demetrius, he would turn around and see Helena, boom, two couples, perfect story. Obviously, it's not that simple. The fairy servant named Puck ends up putting the spell on Lysander, which is the courtship of Hermia, so it's the wrong guy. He ends up becoming infatuated with Helena, who was the last in line here, so that's a little bit messy. The fairies realize they've messed something up. They're like, okay, let's fix it. And then they do find the correct young man named Demetrius, and they put the spell on him as well. So now we have like the whole thing just shifted to Helena being she had nobody to desire her. Now Lysander and Demetrius are infatuated with her. They state their love for her in a very poetic format because they're under a spell, right? And immediately she's, interestingly enough, extremely skeptical of this. She's very doubtful. She thinks they're playing some cruel, mean trick on her, saying, oh, you guys don't actually love me. You're just kind of betraying me. You're kind of exploiting me. And I actually want to read some ideas from the particular text when this happens. So this is the first monologue is from Helena when Lysander is infatuated with her, which is not the guy that she wanted, right? She says, wherefore was I to this keen mockery born? When at your hands did I deserve this scorn? It is not enough, young man, that I did never know, nor never can deserve a sweet look from Demetrius's eye, but you must flout my insufficiency. So you must exploit my insecurities, right? She's already feeling like a lack of self-worth because she's chasing something without being, there's nothing of reciprocal value for her. She's just pursuing. Demetrius is not interested in her. He's interested in Hermia, the first girl, right? So she kind of feels already that lack of self-worth, kind of a little bit of guilt, kind of a little bit of shame when she's pursuing. So she says, I think it's a really interesting line, you must flout my insufficiency. So she kind of just like brushes this off a little bit because again, that's not the particular man that she's interested in. Later in the story, Act 3, Scene 2, this is when Demetrius is under the spell and he actually falls in love with Helena, which, mind you, this is exactly what she wanted the entire time. This up until the beginning of the story, she was pursuing Demetrius, this entire story. But the minute that he confesses his love for her, she's again immediately skeptical, and she goes on this famous monologue. Oh, spite, oh, hell, I see you are all bent to set against me for your merriment. If you were civil and knew courtesy, you would not do that. You would not do me thus much injury. Can you not hate me as I know you do, but you must join in souls to mock me too. So I think it's very interesting, like I said, that she actually wanted admiration. She wanted affirmation. She wanted acknowledgement from Demetrius. But when she was provided with that opportunity, now be it contrived or not from some sort of exogenous spell or flower, nectar, whatever, she doesn't know that. When she had that opportunity to turn on her, she doubted it. She was immediately skeptical. She said, I wanted this the entire time, but now that I have it, I don't feel worthy, right? You must flout my insufficiency. So for this reason, I extracted the principle of, you could say, self-worth and or self-image. I think they coincide with one another. And in talking about this, I think there's a lot of preliminary themes that we can establish. But first of all, why I thought about this is because when she had the object of her desire, when she had attained it, there was doubt. Okay, and I would look at, or she was surprised rather. And I think if you're going toward a goal and you are surprised, that is an indication of doubt. Whether that be doubt that you had the correct capabilities, I think it's a different topic. But more so, you doubted that you were worthy. Right, and that's a very intrinsically derived valuation. You are worthy of this ideal. She was worthy of Demetrius. I don't think she truly believed that. I think she was really forcing herself outside of her comfort zone, and pushing and quote unquote faking it until you make it in the terms of her pursuit. Because once she actually did receive what she wanted, she felt contrived. She felt like people were betraying her, like people were playing some sort of a trick on her when they really weren't. So in terms of our self-worth, I think we tend to, as a general rule, get in life what we feel like we are worthy of, if that makes sense. So self-worth is inherently tied to self-image. The best analogy I've ever heard for self-image is that of a jar, right? So if you picture, for example, let's say a pumpkin or something, and if you put a pumpkin when it's extremely small physically in a jar, the jar is going to it's going to govern the capacity of the size and the strength of that particular pumpkin, even when it's fully grown, even if it has adequate resources, even if the other pumpkins around it are thriving and being much bigger, that jar is the governor. It sets the limit for the outward capacity, you could say, of that pumpkin. Now, our self-image is identical to that jar in terms of psychological, image of symbolism, of course. And the interesting thing is that this self-image it's not something we're born with. It is something that is formulated and created and cultivated through our, I would say, analysis or evaluation of our experiences. And evaluation of experiences can happen in a multitude of ways. So I've actually done a discussion on this before. I brought this book up before in several discussions. There's an entire field of study called psycho-cybernetics. Psycho, obviously meaning mind. Cybernetics is the science of control and communication in animals and some machines. So essentially, how this book, articulates self-image is kind of like a jar, but also kind of like a autopilot. I think it's the best analogy in that particular book. Your self-image can be an autopilot of what you feel like you are quote unquote worthy of. Again, because worthy is it's very ethereal. It's very amorphous. If you ask somebody what they're quote unquote worth in terms of maybe their career income, maybe their relationships, maybe other results in their life, that's all fortified by themselves, right? Nobody is going to have the same answer. And also nobody was born with that answer. That answer was, I would say, conditioned in them from evaluation from their experiences. So backing up for a second to the book, Psycho-Cybernetics, he posits this, Maxwell Maltz posits this as a autopilot works in a flight, you could say. So let's say you have a flight that is scheduled from Los Angeles all the way to New York, right? So across the country. And if that is off, let's say it hits turbulence and it's off maybe 1 or 2 degrees. If you extrapolate that 1 or 2 degrees, you never correct course, you're going to be 100 or 200 miles off course, right? Because of the length of the trip, of course. Now, the autopilot mechanism, the only thing it does is it picks up deviations from that set goal. So it says, okay, here is the ideal path, the linear path from Los Angeles to New York. Okay, these airports, beeline, right? It picks up deviations. So the plane can hit turbulence, it can, whatever weather patterns is going to correct it off course. The autopilot is going to say, okay, I'm going to extrapolate this behavior over here. It's off of this set course. Therefore, I'm going to correct course in terms of, the flaps are adjusted to the plane, maybe the throttles change, etc. And then it's eventually on course again. Our self-image works identical to this pattern of autopilot. And again, like I said, our self-image is governed by how we evaluate our experiences. So bringing this a little bit more from the realm of conceptual into practical, I can give you an example from my own life into how this manifested in my life in terms of self-worth, and actually relating a story kind of to Helena a little bit. And this was in, I would say, my early formative years of late teenage, early adulthood life, where I was very reclusive, right? So I was very antisocial in a negative way. I didn't really value solitude. I always saw myself as kind of like a loner. I always socially isolated myself, whether it be deliberately or unconsciously. And I was similar to, I saw kind of a parallel to Helena's situation here, where she was kind of forcing herself to pursue something that she thought she might want. And this manifested in my behavior with, I saw the quote unquote in crowd, right? I saw the cool kids of in your high school, all these little cliques and everything like that. I wanted to be in with the in crowd. So what I would do is I would force myself to hang out with those people, right? And I was doing this with the belief that I was a loner, that I wasn't really fitting in, that I was kind of forcing myself to do this, that I didn't believe that I was quote unquote worthy of, being with their inside jokes and all these things, right? So I had that hypothesis. So I was ignoring that belief and fortifying my self-image through a contrived and artificial way. And how this manifested, of course, was like inauthentic behavior. I think people can inherently sense when somebody's trying to fake being around them, or they're trying to get validation, or they're just trying to do something deceptive, and it's not really all there. It's not authentic. They're not really being themselves. I think people can implicitly feel that, even if they can't articulate it, right? So this would happen in me forcing myself to hang out with these people, trying to bend who I was to fit their narrative, trying to, for example, laugh at their inside jokes. Even if I didn't really get them, I just wanted that social validation, right? And they would obviously pick up on this. Like they would say, oh, they wouldn't say it, but they would think, how would you know? How would you understand the context of that joke? You weren't with us that night. You weren't in on that joke, whatever. But this would manifest in itself because, like I said, I was forcing myself to kind of adopt their narrative and fit in this way. And my evaluated experience ended up expressing itself because I was eventually alienated from that group, of course, because like I said, I was inauthentic. And then my inherent beliefs that were along the lines of, okay, I'm not worthy of being with this group. I'm an outsider, I'm an outcast, I'm weird, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all ended up being fortified and with I would say the subjective identity attached to that. So another example that is used in psycho-cybernetics is along the lines of self-image, where you could have two people. Let's say we're both taking an exam in college. One person fails, we both receive a 60 on an exam. Okay, so that's a D, that's an F, that's a passing grade, or a failing grade rather. Person A can say, I objectively failed that test. I received a 60 out of 100. Okay, I need to study more. I need to do this. I wasn't prepared. I wasn't adequately competent, etc. Person B can say, I failed that test because I am a failure, because I am not good at math, because I'm not the type of person who excels at academia, etc. Right? Person B is attaching a subjective identity to their performance. In other words, we are evaluating our performances differently. And that is going to fortify or change our self-images accordingly. Because like I said, none of us are born with self-worth or a self-image. And I think it's conditioned through our experiences, so to speak. So moving on to the third point here, what we can learn, what we can apply from this discussion from Midsummer's Night Dream, from self-worth, from self-image. I think there is a few. I think first is to analyze situations and patterns when you are uncomfortable. And what you want to do is, when you analyze situations when you're uncomfortable, you want to figure out if it's attributed to one of two things. Whether it's one, a story that you're telling yourself about your identity. In other words, be especially careful and aware of insidious phrases like, I'm not the type of person who XYZ. So a practical example, when I'm a very, very, very introverted person. When I started to do these meetups, for example, when I started to do presentations in person, when I started to moderate groups in person, I would tell myself, I'm not the type of person who's competent at public speaking, or I'm ashamed of the possibility that people might reject what I have to offer, or XYZ, right? It's a story that I was telling myself. I'm not that type of person. I'm an introvert, right? These are labels that we use to justify complacency, I would say, because people are extremely, extremely, extremely malleable, right? So that's the first thing you want to look out for is, when you're uncomfortable, are you either telling yourself a story, or is it due to a lack of your ability and or competence? Because that, of course, is a reality too, right? You might be saying, I can't do this because I've never done this before. That's perfectly warranted. That has perfect merit and utility. But if it's saying, I can't do XYZ, I can't approach that person, I can't make this sale, I can't make this level of income, I can't, hold a marriage together, I can't become a social person, XYZ, because of the type of person I am, that's a subjective identification statement, and that can be malleable. So don't, hide behind that identity of telling yourself, I'm not the type of person who XYZ, because again, you can change that in an instant. So the second point that I have is to kind of improve your self-image, improve your sense of self-worth, is to first establish the type of person that you want to become. I've personally found in my life, an ideal increment is about 12 months at a time. So a lot of people say, obviously set goals long-term and short-term, but for me, if my goal is too long-term, if my ideal, if my vision is too long-term, it's not necessarily motivating enough, because my actions will appear minuscule in relation to closing this gap between point A and point B. But if it's a year, it's far enough where it's like, these circumstances are so distant from where I am today, so it's motivating, but it's also practical enough. All I have to do is divide that in 12 increments, and I can get, okay, monthly goals. Here's what I have to do to be on track, etc. So I found 1 year is perfect for me in designing my ideal, so to speak. And then what I do is I work deductively, and I ask myself, who is quote unquote worthy of this ideal? Okay, this can work in a practical career like income statement. If you could say, I earn X amount of dollars a year, who's the type of person who earns that money in my job? What do they do? What are the type of responsibilities they have? What are their attributes? What are their strengths? How do they address themselves to people, etc.? So work deductively and act as if you were already in possession of the goals that you've established yourself for the next year, right? And that way you're going to see yourself as quote unquote worthy of these results, because you're already acting as if you are the person in that. And to close, I think one more final point is, I do see a little bit of merit in the idea of quote unquote faking it until you make it, but with a caveat, because I don't really know how to find this boundary, but I do think there is a balance. If we fake it too far, if we push ourselves too far out of our comfort zone, I think this is what Helena was doing in Midsummer Night's Dream, by the way. You're pushing yourself too far so that when you actually get the result, you don't even feel worthy of it anymore. You get skeptical. You're like, someone's playing a trick on me. I'm not worthy of this. I didn't earn this. I didn't sacrifice enough. I didn't, invest enough resources in this. I'm not worthy of this. I'm not competent, etc. XYZ, whatever we want to tell ourselves. So I think that is a manifestation of stepping too far outside of our comfort zone or faking it too far. And that's actually something we're going to get to in the breakout room. So in summation, evaluate when we are uncomfortable, and attribute this discomfort to telling yourself, I'm not the type of person who does these things. Be especially aware of that insidious phrase, because that can psychologically, chain us in our current circumstances. Or when you are uncomfortable, attribute that to lack of ability. That's perfectly merit, that has perfect utility, but then address those weaknesses. And then the second point is set your ideal, work deductively, act as if you were already in possession of those things. And then this will improve your self-worth, your self-image. You will see yourself in a more positive light. You will have a healthy relationship with yourself, and you will feel like you are worthy of all of the blessings that are ubiquitous to us throughout daily life. So with that said, I'm going to pass it on to Shrikant to moderate Q&A.
Wonderful, folks. So we have 4 rules for questions as usual. Number 1, if you have a question, go ahead and type exclamation mark in chat or raise your hand in Zoom. Number 2, keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. Number 4, speak your mind, disagree with anybody on anything, and do so courteously. So let's start with Shelly. Shelly, go ahead.
Hey, John, I really love this topic. It's funny, I've actually been thinking about some of these very concepts this week, mainly because of a Brene Brown podcast I listened to lately. I don't know if you're familiar with her and some of the work that she does, but she echoed, to your point, the idea of what are the stories are we telling ourselves, right, in terms of our reactions with other people. And then what you're saying is the stories we're telling ourselves in reaction to ourselves, right? So as I've been thinking about where I came to a healthy balance in my own feelings of self-worth towards me, towards myself, they really had to do with me accepting, extending grace to myself and accepting my imperfections, right? So the idea of that there's certain things I'm going to do well, certain things that I'm not really designed to do well. I'm going to improve the best that I can on them, but really accepting that and embracing the totality of that which I'm good at and that which I'm just not great at. Is that kind of some of what you're talking about, or would you elaborate a little bit on that idea of accepting who we are in that fullness? Because for me, I think that really, when I rested in that knowledge, I really began to value myself in a completely different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I do like the idea of accepting imperfections because this is the necessary predicate that is going to lead to the desire for growth, right? Because if I determine myself as like, okay, I am this role. I've actually talked about this in the past as identifying with attributes instead of identifying with roles. So this could look like I'm a type of person who loves, bringing people together, or I love facilitating connection, or I love expressing myself creatively, right? Those are attributes. Roles would be like, I am a construction worker, I am a parent, I am this, right? Those are boxes. They're kind of limiting, and you can't really express yourself unless you're in that role of the job. So if you're a construction worker, what do you do outside of your 9 to 5? It's like, I'm no longer a construction, you know what I mean? It's like you're kind of stuck in that little box from 9 to 5. Whereas if you identify with roles and you say, okay, I'm imperfect, I have these imperfections, but I'm allowing myself to grow, that's going to express in every single opportunity that you have in terms of relationships with yourself, relationships with other people, and also exploring who you are and what makes you unique. And also, I agree with you, more cultivating this self-acceptance, right? This self-worth, this self-love. It's actually a question for the breakout group. We're typically talk about self-love and narcissism, conceit, etc. But if you accept your imperfections, you have to know point A and point B. And if you're not objective with yourself about point A, you can't necessarily, you can grow, but it's going to be very vague. It's going to be very haphazard. It's going to be very random in terms of your progress. Whereas if you adequately define, okay, I'm here, here's my weaknesses, you have to be really honest with yourself, really humble, here's my weaknesses, and here's where I want to go, you can then work deductively and say, okay, these are the areas of my life that I need the most growth in. These are the areas of my life that are hindering me and limiting and suffocating all of the other areas of my life. So if I put this one, Pareto principle, 20% of my effort into 80% of this trait, I'm going to blossom, I'm going to flourish, etc. And that would never come if we didn't accept our imperfections.
Thank you. Next up is Joe.
Hi, John. Fantastic presentation. Welcome back. The idea in Stoicism that had come to mind for me was the idea of making value judgments. So calling something good or bad to begin with is kind of where we start to fall down, and we start to have a either inflated sense of self or even a lack of self-confidence. So, do you see that as it's more just a rational behavior and just value judgments that we're making externally as the problem when we're having an inflated sense of self or even a lack of self-worth.
What do you mean in particular about value judgments? Like on the internal world or more so on the external world? Like, can
External.
you provide a context?
So you're saying externally, you're making value judgments, what are good or bad, and then that becomes internal. So the idea is that you start to make judgments about other people, but then it's really just a reflection of oneself at that point. So does that make sense?
Sort of. Can you provide like a specific example that you have in mind or something?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can provide an example would be if I criticize a colleague's performance on something and we work on a similar type of task. Well, maybe it's something that I'm a perfectionist on my end. Therefore, I make a value judgment based on what they're, so basically I'm judging his values or what he's contributing based on my own personal imperfections. But what I'm calling good or bad is really, I'm just transferring over to my, the judgment. So I'm judging him and I'm really judging myself. So that really is impacting oneself. Does that make sense? It's a little bit convoluted.
No. I get what you're saying. Absolutely. I do agree with that. It can lead to like a conflated or inflated sense of self-worth or even insecurity or insufficiency. And I think a good thing to do can be to substitute those words like good or bad with like constructive or deconstructive or destructive. Those are things that I use in my everyday vernacular and vocabulary in terms of like when I'm trying to judge the validity of a behavior, for example. If I'm kind of on the fence of something that I'm doing in terms of a habit, in terms of an action, in terms of like evaluating a conversation that I have with somebody or a relationship with somebody, I can say, is this constructive? And if it's constructive, if it's getting me closer, again, this is all predicated on my ideal. It's constructive if it's getting me closer to that point B that I established for myself every 12 months. It's destructive if it's leading me astray, right? So it's like, and then once you have, but again, if you don't have that ideal, everything is kind of chaotic, everything is confusing, everything is random, everything. That's when I think we're going to fall into the realm of like, okay, this is good or bad. We're going to be more projecting our ideals on the ideals of society. We're not going to become collaborative. We're going to become selfish. We're going to become, self-centered and only focusing on what is benefiting us. And I think that's a very, I would say, dangerous way to operate if we don't have an ideal, because like I said, everything is going to be random. It's going to be harder to determine the validity of ideas. It's also going to be harder to reflect on our ideas, because if we reflect, we don't really know what we're looking for unless we have an established goal. Similarly, like the example you provided, if you're criticizing your coworker's performance, you guys have to establish a mutual, maybe not even mutual, you just have to establish the intention or the goal or the ideal or the motive for this work. Like, what's the goal? What's the end result? What's point B? And then you can work deductively and say, okay, this is correct or incorrect, right or wrong, constructive, destructive, et cetera. Whatever like polarity, whatever vocabulary you use to describe this polarity, either closer to or further away from that goal, I think it's up to them. But they do need to have that established ideal, I would say, whether internally or if you're working collaboratively with people.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Jean, followed by Jyoti. Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's when you're talking about that example, the person takes the text, then one person thinks he's failed, the other person wants to make more effort. It reminds me of the book I'm listening right now. It's called Mindset. One is more growth mindset, the other one is fixed mindset. So I think it's quite interesting. There's a lot of things we're reading or learning. There's a lot of similarity between them. And I also learned like what they call EQ actually is about how much you understand yourself and others. So when you understand your strengths and weakness, so then that's actually real confidence. Then when people point out about your weakness, you already know, so you won't feel like you won't feel be attacked because you already understand it. So I think that's kind of higher EQ people. So I just want to ask, what do you think about these two similarities?
Yeah, there's definitely congruences to that polarity of like fixed mindset and growth mindset. In terms of the example that I brought up. So if I were to identify with a fixed mindset, and like I said, this is the idea of like saying I'm not the type of person who, you can very rapidly hide all of your weaknesses by saying I'm not the type of person who, insert strengths here. So coalescing this actually with Shelley's point of like accepting your imperfections, accepting your weaknesses, accepting your insecurities. You shouldn't define yourself in these boxes. So it would have just been as easy for me to say, I'm not the type of person who, expresses my opinions. I'm an introvert. I'm quiet. People don't like what I have to say. I'm not articulate. I'm this, that. And that's going to justify complacency, because that's immediately putting a blanket over the exact circumstances of my life. And it's putting a wall on my growth, because that's not going to allow me to address, like Shelley was saying, address my imperfections or any weaknesses. And it's not going to allow me to grow, because it's saying I'm the type of person who is okay and I'm tolerating all of my circumstances right now, even though I'm capable of more. Okay. One of the most powerful quotes, it's just like not even a quote, it's just a simple idea. Peterson says it: you are not all that you could be, and you know it. Like, that is a haunting idea. That is a haunting idea for me, because like there's always this possibility to further express yourself. And if you say, I'm not the type of person who, or you identify with these boxes, or you just justify complacency in a especially insidious or furtive way, in a subtle way, by justifying this, because the mind is very good at doing that. I think it's going to put a wall on our growth. And that's going to be back to the metaphor of the jar and the pumpkin, right? It's just like, that is something we create with our minds. And if we're not careful, we can get comfortable in that jar. We can say, oh, this jar is just how I live. I'm just this size of pumpkin, even though these people over here are flourishing, even though I have plenty of resources growing through this vine. I have access to this water, this sunlight, this soil, these resources, but I'm cutting myself off from that because of the story that I tell myself.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Jyoti. Jyoti, go ahead.
Yeah, John, as usual, your presentation is great, right to the point. I'm going to turn the things around a little bit here for you to answer me this. When you think you are not all that, and other people think that you are all that, and you get placed in situations where people are now expecting from you because they think you're all that, right? So you fake it. You fake it and you make it and you feel good about it. And it starts rubbing on you, because now people have started to love you, because you are trying very hard and they don't know you are trying hard, and whatever you are presenting is likable. So what happened? What is your opinion in those circumstances with a person who didn't have it but started to get it? What do you think about that?
Yeah, that is actually really is an important idea. And that's kind of what I try to address in Black Mirror with the episode on internal validation we talked about with Nosedive. Because I do think, like you said, I think it's healthy to have that level of maybe skepticism, maybe kind of doubt, or maybe like focusing on where you can grow, focusing on your weaknesses with yourself, because that's not going to lead to an overinflated ego, or you're not going to overestimate your strengths or your capabilities, your talents. So I do think it's in my opinion, preferable, especially in my, autobiographical example, in my yearly review of like my performance, I keep a very meticulous journal. I track everything I do every single day. I extract some insight, pattern, etc. every single day. So what I do at the end of every year, I focus on what I did the worst. I ignore my accomplishments. I ignore all the highest highs, all of what I did good, all that stuff, because if I only focus on that, similar to what you're saying with other people, if they all say, oh, you're this, this is why you're so great, I love this about you, I take that with a grain of salt. I say, yes, thank you. Of course, it's very, very appreciated. But if I listen to that too much, the ego will get comfortable, and this will kind of slip back into what we were just talking about, of this static mindset, of this like security, of like this constrictive focusing on stasis, right? It's not focusing on growth. To grow, you have to be vulnerable. To be vulnerable, you have to focus on your imperfections, and you have to realize that you are never complete, right? You're never whole. You're never comprehensive. You always have weaknesses. There's always work to do. And that's what makes life worth living and beautiful, because there's always a task to do. There's always room to grow, to evolve, to explore, to flourish, to engage in some adventure in some way. So I think there is a particular balance, and this might be idiosyncratic in terms of who focuses on more criticism or more praise. But I do ultimately think I also ultimately follow the words of Epictetus, where he says personal merit cannot be derived from an external source. So ultimately, it's you who have to dictate your own self-worth, your self-image, and what you believe to be true about yourself through the stories that you tell yourself and subscribe to.
Wonderful. Last question is from David, and then we have an announcement, and then we're going to go into breakout rooms. David.
So John, great presentation. Really started getting me thinking. And just as you were answering that last question, you may have touched on an answer to my question. So what are your thoughts with regard to those people that require external recognition to establish their own self-worth? What are you going to say? That they lack confidence in themselves, that they always are looking for that external recognition to validate themselves, to recognize or establish that self-worth that they may feel. It's, in other words, they require an external feedback. They can't satisfy themselves with their accomplishments or with their achievements.
I personally think it's a big weakness. I've fallen prey to that psychological pattern for many years of my life. I wasn't able to validate myself, and it did come from a place of deep insecurity, from a place of almost kind of self-loathing for a little bit, a lack of faith in myself. I didn't really like the thoughts that I would have toward myself when I was alone. It makes me think of a Blaise Pascal quote. He says, "All man's miseries derive from not being able to sit in a quiet room alone." Right? So it's like, if you're uncomfortable with the thoughts of yourself, if you can't validate yourself, if you don't have a healthy relationship with yourself, you're going to seek external validation in other people. Now, there's a caveat to this. Of course, I do think we need social praise as a biological organism, because we evolved in tribes. I do think we need some level of that. You can't just live as a hermit and completely validate yourself. We do need some affirmation, some social love, etc., affection. But if you constantly rely on that as an external source, I do think it's extremely meretricious and superficial, because it's not going to be comprehensively like impactful, meaning that they don't know, like, as good as a mask as I can put on, the people that are, affirming me, complimenting me, praising me, they don't know the comprehensive facets of myself. They only know what I present to them. Therefore, the only thing they can contribute toward is what I present to them, if that makes sense. Even if I have a lot of self-awareness and I authentically present myself as vulnerable as I want to be, there's still added layers of my psyche that they will never have access to, right? So I don't think they can ever accurately, completely validate you. Or if they do, I think it would only lead to like this little emotional hit of dopamine, and it wouldn't lead to anything lasting and fulfilling. And that's why they have to do it more and more and more and more. And I think that's what we were talking about with internal validation in one of the last discussions. I do think, I don't think it's a long-term strategy that is sustainable, right? So people can do it, but it's kind of escapism. It's looking at, this validation from this person. Sure, it might feel good in the moment, but I don't think it's an effective strategy in the long term.
Wonderful. So now we're going to do a quick announcement, and then we'll take one more question from Mark. So what we're going to do is from this year, John is going to be presenting every other Friday. He wants to focus on his other projects, so he'll be presenting every other Friday. When John is not presenting, we've got a new presenter, Shali, and I want to introduce her. This is, I did a full interview with her about her life. This is the interview on YouTube. I would recommend seeing it. And she's going to be talking about this theme. So Shali, could you give a preview of your series and what's coming up next Friday?
Sure. So Shrikant asked me if I would be willing to lead the meetup every other Friday, and he basically gave me the open floor, whatever I wanted. But it seems that I've noticed here in a lot of the meetups on 52 Living Ideas, a lot of the themes are, the base of everything is fear, is what drives us a lot. And if you listen to my story, or you had an opportunity to be here when I shared it, you will know that that's something that I faced in my own life a lot, is overcoming fear. I was left with 5 children and no income and no support system, and I've had to overcome a lot and have a great career now, and recently bought a home. And so I'm going to be talking a lot about fear, overcoming fear. I'm trying to lay it out in a very chronological order. And so the very first thing we're going to be talking about is how really understanding ourselves at a very deep level lays a foundation for being able to take actionable steps to overcome our fear. So we're going to do this in a layered approach where we're going to start and build a base and then build upon it. And hopefully those that attend will be able to learn some life lessons and glean some ideas and maybe be inspired to face their own fears in life.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Shelley. And I recommend looking at her story. When she posted her story on LinkedIn, I think she got 500,000 people to like the story. So there is something good about it. So I'm really, really delighted to have Shelley presenting. All right, we'll take one more question and then we'll go to breakout rooms. Last question from Mark. Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about the last point about you're judging oneself based upon others. I think it's important to make the caveat that it's very important to listen to what others and see what others say about you, and to try to, whether it's good or bad, and to take it in seriously, but to critique that critique and to try to get a deeper understanding of oneself through the perception of others, but to always reserve one's judgment and to make the final, assessment of oneself. It should be something that's, somewhat obviously autonomous, but it shouldn't be, in a sense, being contemptuous or alienating the ideas of other people. Otherwise, you can live in a vacuum and not have a really. It's hard to be able to interpret it because what people say and what their motives are. But I think it's very important to take heed about what other people and how they react to you, et cetera, in improving, but reserving one's judgment.
I completely agree with that. I do want to reiterate, I don't want to completely subordinate the utility or merit in people's any external advice. I would say I've received greatly valuable advice in my own life from other people, and I think I just tended to value their input because they were a very analytical person. They were very self-reflective. They had a lot of intuitive, judgments about themselves. So they inherently, just like you can argue, projecting onto me whatever they saw in me, right? But it was still valuable because we think on the same frequency. And they were of a very different temperament, right? So they were a very like comprehensive thinker in terms of like less analytical than me, or less compartmentalized, I would say, than me. Very, very in touch with their emotions. I've kind of gone through patterns where I've like not alienated that, but like looked at things and try to overly rationalize emotional processes in my connections and my relationships. So I do also see a lot of merit in the fact that people can learn a lot about their like attachment styles to any, like, even if it's not like a relationship, it could just be a friendship or any other dynamic. They can learn a lot about that through an intimate connection with somebody. And the most profound psychological advice I've ever received from a friend was after, I had developed a kind of a pretty deep emotional connection with them, and they were allowed to see me in a certain light that I'm not going to say I've never seen myself in, but I've definitely repressed and buried sides of my character. And they were able to point it out to me like that because it was a prevalent phenomenon in themselves too. And they were like, hey, what is that about? And I'm like, what is what about? I thought I was hiding it, right? What is what about? And they were saying this, you do this XYZ thing when this happens. This is a pattern. And then I had to do a lot of introspection after that. So, and that led to a significant amount of growth in my life. So I'm not going to completely, subordinate, like I said, the advice from other people. I do see it as extremely valuable, but taken with a grain of salt, of course, just as everything.
Great. John, do you want to tell people about the questions that, you want them to consider during the breakout rooms?
Yeah, so we have 3 questions to moderate discussion around in these breakout rooms. The first is, why is self-love often conflated with narcissism or conceit? Second question is it possible to act too far out of our comfort zone? And if so, what are some indicators that we're too far? Third question is, do you think the phrase fake it until you make it does more harm or more good in growth of people's lives?
All right, excellent. So we're going to start the breakout rooms now. The breakout rooms will last for 20 minutes. And I put the rules for the breakout rooms. And we'll see you back in 20 minutes here, where we'll be able to share our takeaways. All right, starting the breakout rooms now. Welcome back, folks. Welcome back. So it is time for takeaways. The way we're going to do takeaways is each person gets 1 to 2 minutes to talk about what they're walking away with. What did they learn about self-worth in this meetup? And as you speak, both I and John are going to keep track of everything everybody's saying. And then we will focus on common themes that come up from that. And this is going to be on a volunteer basis. So if you would like to share your takeaways, and I encourage you to do so, please go ahead and type ! in Zoom, in the chat, or you can raise your hand in Zoom in order to do that. While people are getting ready with their takeaways, let me tell you some new things coming up. What I'm doing this year is I'm getting a whole bunch of authors. I'm going to interview a whole bunch of authors. I went through my entire library and identified all the authors I would like to talk to. I found 25. I've chose 25. Unfortunately, 8 of them are dead. I don't know how to talk to them. But 17 are alive. And I sent my test email to 4 of them. And I was hoping that 2 of them would say yes. And 3 of them have said yes. So it's a very good ratio. So now I'm going to go all whole hog. So this Sunday at 12 p.m., we have Michael Strong. He's the author of Habit of Thinking, How to Convert Socratic Seminar into Socratic Practice. Also, Be the Solution about Conscious Capitalism. He's also pioneer in education. He has a whole range of programs for schools. So he's an amazing, amazing character. I'm going to be interviewing him on Sunday at 12 p.m. On Tuesday at 9 p.m., one of my favorite authors is Julian Jaynes. He has deep insights on consciousness and what writing has done for us and how our consciousness has developed. So the theme is going to be Origin of Consciousness, and the head of the Julian Jaynes Society, Marcel, I don't know how to pronounce his name, last name, but he's going to be here. He's the preeminent authority on Julian Jaynes' work. And he's going to be talking, we're going to be talking about Origins of Consciousness. That's going to be Tuesday at 9 p.m. And then next Saturday, we're going to have a really special person. One of my favorite ideas is OODA loop by John Boyd. And I have one of his close associates who worked with him for almost 2 decades to come and talk about John Boyd, the OODA loop, and how, I mean, he was, Chet Richards was instrumental in helping John Boyd sell the idea of OODA loop to the Pentagon. So he's been involved in this process for a long time. So it's my honor to talk to him on Saturday at 12 p.m. So that's what is coming up. All right, folks. So who would like to start with their takeaways? You can go ahead and type ! I strongly recommend sharing your takeaways because that's the best way to get the most value out of these meetups. So next up is going to be Jean, Becky, and Deborah. Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, we have a great discussion. We only have 3 or 4 people, and Dave and Peggy. I actually get a lot of insight. We were talking about, is it good to fake it until make it? We had this conclusion, actually, group play. I found this quite interesting, like architecture. When you fake too much, you collapse. But if you fake a little bit, like just to your potential, like overhang, the building usually can overhang about 3 feet, up to 3 feet without a post. So if you're stretched before 3 feet, and then you give your potential of space to grow to that, then it's good. But if you give your space and you never grow to it, they keep faking it, then it's bad. You become imposter syndrome. So I found it's quite interesting. And also we were talking about why some people in church, we feel they're hypocrite because they're pretending to be something nice they were told to be, but they're not. So, and actually David did a great analysis about why you feel uncomfortable with people who are hypocrite, because they gave you signals that conflict with each other. Like they have their behavior actually conflict. It's not consistent. Was there some people you think they're pretty bad when you first see them, bad personality, but because they're consistent or authenticity, you actually grow to be comfortable with them. It's, oh, they're not too bad actually. They're just their personality, and you can predict how they react. So I found it quite insightful. Thank you.
Full. Thank you. Thank you, Jean. Next up is Becky, Deborah, and Joe. Becky, go ahead.
I wanted to share a little bit about being open to criticism. And so my thoughts on that is that the closer we identify our actions, our weaknesses, our thoughts and beliefs to who we are as a person really dictates our the strength of our response to criticism. So when we say what we do or our actions equate to who we are, that's really hard to change. It's in the state of it is. But when we say that, when we dissociate from that, then that's something we can change, because failure does not cause us to feel that lack of self-worth. So that's all.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Becky. Next up is going to be Deborah, Joe, Chataranj, Betty, Jyoti, Kevin, and Mark. Deborah, go ahead.
Okay, so we talked a lot about narcissism and like the first question. So yeah, so I would say like true self-love probably isn't narcissism, and that insecurity would be more a hallmark of that. But I think that people are probably threatened by others who are confident in themselves. So they'll say like, oh, you're really vain, or oh, you're really narcissistic, or I don't like that person, whatever. But I think it's absolutely possible to have a high opinion of yourself and still want others to succeed. I think you can have compassion for other people and be able to share the spotlight. And if you want other people to self-actualize, then like that can be mutually beneficial, because then you can connect with those people and you can say, okay, I'm not threatened by that. Like I like myself, but I want other people to like themselves too. So I think that maybe it's a misunderstanding of people who really like themselves or like things about themselves, if maybe you don't like things about yourself, I guess. But I think we should, all want everyone to, like I said, succeed or self-actualize.
Wonderful. Thank you, Deborah. Next up is going to be Joe, Chatranj, and Betty. Joe.
I mean, Deborah just said exactly what I was going to say, but more eloquently, is the idea of self-care and how people can perceive that and conflate it with the idea of narcissism. But there's a clear line between those two. I think that, the idea when you're doing something at the expense of other individuals, it starts to be a very, clear line. That's narcissism. But I can see how people could conflate that with self-care and self-love, because they feel like they're entitled to a certain certain amount of attention or whatever, feedback. I'm trying to think of the right word, but regardless, that it's more, they're probably narcissists themselves because they think they're entitled to something that they're not. So it's kind of like, it really is interesting in the sense that how people are calling other people narcissists when they probably are feeling the same way. The idea of pushing yourself outside your comfort zone, and when do you know you've gone too far? I think that's a really personal choice. I think there are some indicators where you just you burn out or something along those. It's just, you just collapse. But I don't. It's really hard to make that limit, to set that limit, because the more you push yourself, you really don't know how far you can go. You don't. It's a journey. So I think that's a real personal choice. I don't think there's a real clear indicator per se out there that would be, evident to me anyway, that you've gone too far. So anyway, that's my takeaway.
Thank you, Joe. Next up is Charantej, Betty, and Jyoti. Charantej, go ahead.
Yeah. So this is my first time to meetup. Hi guys. So my takeaways from this meetup are, I like the point about like we discussed in the breakout room about like faking it until you make it. So basically what we discussed is that um, you will be successful in faking it only if you understand yourself truly. If you try to fake it without understanding yourself truly, you'll fail at it. So yeah, so the first step is to understand yourself before faking yourself. And also like the point in the lecture about how you should take other people opinions. So I like the point that so what other people's perceive is about you is what you are presenting to them. It doesn't mean that it's true about you. So you should take them and try to see if that makes sense and try to improve yourself if that makes sense. Or yeah, so but you should not take it in a negative way and like demotivate yourself.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Charantej. Next up is Betty, Jyoti, Kevin, Mark, Paul, and Judith. Betty, go ahead.
Yeah, my main takeaway from the talk today was that when we're uncomfortable, we should look at the story we're telling ourselves and see if we have a growth mindset or a fixed mindset, and we're actually tapping into self-limiting beliefs. And also from the discussion that we had, I thought that rather than faking it till you make it, that we should be authentic. And also I like the point about emotional IQ being that you understand yourself and others, because I think that ultimately when you understand yourself, your true self, and you're living from authenticity, that means that you're genuinely powerful rather than faking it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Betty. Great points. Next up is Jyoti, Kevin, and Mark. Jyoti.
Okay, before I answer these three questions, we had a very good breakout room discussions. And I think after talking to everyone, and I don't think I mentioned that in my breakout room, there's something called self-reflection. And it is so important to have because none of these three things that John mentioned are bad for us. We need to love, we need to love ourselves. There is a fine slope that you need to sit back and think about it. That am I crossing that? And now I'm looking like I'm a narcissistic person and I'm just going on with my own drill. So that depends on every individual. I'm the kind of person who does do that and very frequently, not just a few times here and there. I always kind of judge myself, evaluate myself. Am I going too far with it? And that is true with the faking and making too. Otherwise, people, it's very good to fake. It is very good because I think when I faked to make it and I made it, I enjoyed it not because hey, my ego got pampered. It's because I think I got trained and people gave me their feedback. They gave me positive reinforcement, and that helped me to understand myself a little bit. And there's nothing wrong with that. But again, there is a fine line. You have to sit back, you have to reflect, and you have to find out um, who you are, actually, what you are. And
Thank
the
you.
last one,
No, go ahead.
I'm going to end it. I know you get a little impatient with me, but I'm just going to end it. Um, Actually, I can end it because I've answered all those. Yeah, that's
Wonderful.
comfort zone. Comfort
Thank
zone.
you.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Jyoti.
Yeah.
Next up is Kevin, Mark, Paul, Judith, and Jen.
Thank you, John. And actually, John in our breakout room, so lucky talked to him a lot. We need a self-growth mindset to get self-knowledge and to get to know ourselves better. Self-love is more for me, right? Self-love is more self-respect, self-balance than and I say the measurement of self-worth needs both self-awareness and external validation. The self-aware is about the self-question yourself, and the external recognition or feedback to confirm your own achievement. There is nothing to lose by try it until you make it. If you not make it, self-challenge is still fun to practice. That's all.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Mark, Paul, Judith, and Jen. Mark.
Okay, so yeah, a lot's been discussed by people prior, but I did want to quick shout out to the people in my group. I wanted to thank them for all their ideas. I had a good conversation. Didn't get a chance to thank them before we got cut off. But one thing, we did spend a lot of time talking about what do we actually mean by love and self-love. And my personal prejudice, and I think some other people use the word too, is it should be based upon compassion. That's a very big component of love. And so if you want to have some self-love, you need to be compassionate with yourself. And because the benefit of that is if you can be compassionate with yourself, you can learn to be compassionate with others, which my prejudice is that's a good thing. And I think somebody else mentioned it just a moment ago. Also, as part of that whole thing about self-love and self-validation, it's important to understand who you are. So yeah, John talked about that earlier on in his talk, and I think that's important to call out. So if you don't know who you are, it's very hard to practice these other things.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. Great observations as always. Next up is Paul, Judith, Jen, and Leslie. Paul.
Yeah, thanks. Mark took very similar path to where what I wanted to say, and but I'll put it in a little different way. This confusion of self-love with narcissism is about that, maybe, meaning if we see someone loving themselves by having compassion toward themselves, we don't conflate it with narcissism, and it almost transmits back to us like we want to be like that. But if we see someone sort of bragging about their accomplishments, it's nothing to do with compassion toward themselves, and so we don't. So there's a way to distinguish between the two, but I think that's part of that difference is admiring someone's strength in their compassion toward themselves, because you see how that relates to how anyone could do that, and it's something to be proud of and love yourself for. And secondly, I wanted to say that the thing about limits and whether you can go beyond your comfort zone, there's a way I thought of in this tonight of deciding that, which is if you're going to be okay with the outcome, whatever it is, because you're going to grow from that, then you can't go out of your limits. The case you go out of your limits is if one outcome is going to devastate you and another outcome is going to be great, that's sort of going out of your limits. So it's all about your psychological capability to embrace whatever the conclusion is of the thing you're endeavoring on that may or may not take you out of your comfort zone. Those are my thoughts. Thanks.
Wow, excellent. Thank you, Paul. Thanks. Next up is Judith. Judith, go ahead.
Yeah, so I've never been more confused after one of these things. But Shrikant, you always say if you go away with more questions, that's a good thing. So my takeaway, I guess, is what John said about the stories you tell yourself, or I'm not a person who XYZ. And then the topic in our discussion when we were talking about too is like, where's the boundary between what is selfish and what is self-love? And I mean, I was having, that's like what I was thinking about when John was talking, because my mind was just bouncing to the two extremes. I'm like, I'm totally on this end of the spectrum. No, wait a minute, I'm totally selfish. I'm totally over here. And I'm just going to give you a small, like very silly example. I mean, there are way more serious things, but just maybe to illustrate. So I don't think I'm a very materialistic person. When the holiday season comes around, everybody's giving gifts. It just doesn't really come very naturally, and seems like a chore to me to think, oh, what do I have to get this person? So I don't know whether I'm telling myself stories because I'm too lazy or too selfish, to take the effort to think, oh, come on, what would this person like? But I mean, like, that's the kind of thing that I'm like, but it just every year it just doesn't feel right to me, and I don't do it well, and I don't like to do it. And I think that that's a small example of the kind of thing that where I'm second guessing myself too about where is selfish, where is self-love, where do I draw the boundary, when am I protecting myself, when should I be compromising more, and that kind of thing. So a lot of questions, no answers yet, but I think I will use that tactic of ask myself, like, what story am I telling myself? I am not a person, or I'm not the person who does XYZ. I kind of like that. I'll try it out.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Judith. And yeah, I love questions, and let's see if we can formulate. There are actually many questions that come out of this. So once everybody's done, let's see what are the core questions that people are asking. You know, what are the basic issues that people are considering? Next up is Jen, Leslie, and Leah. Jen. DJENNE. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay, yeah, I got it.
Go ahead.
So basically, I just wanted to talk a little bit about like the last question about like about faking it to make it, and like if it's a harmful thing. So like the people in my group, we talked a little bit about how like if you really know yourself and your principles, then it isn't really faking it. And I also think that like if you practice something, you can truly become the person that you're trying to fake, you know? And that's all I have to say, really.
Okay, thank you, Jen. Next up is Leslie, Leah, and Priyanka. Leslie.
Thank you, everyone. I was so glad to see this pop up in my email, and I was actually coming off another training having to do with self-psychology and the value of twinship to feel belonging and all this stuff. So it was really cool. So grateful, and I'm going to watch the stuff I've missed. I do want to share on a couple of things. First of all, yeah, narcissistic is such a psychiatric term. And it has to do with even like the deepest levels of diagnosis, even because personality disorders are run so much deeper, and you can't, you know, it's beyond presentation, and everyone looks different. So I'm just going to throw that out there. Number one. Number two, I love this concept of this discussion of fake it till you make it. What I do with my work a lot has to do with identifying the stages of change. So I feel like rather than someone being at a stage of change that they're not ready for, that kind of speaks to, I guess, the readiness factor that was in the previous question. I feel like that's valuable. If one is in a pre-contemplation stage of change, they're not ready to do anything. Right? They don't even think there's a problem. They're like, what's up with these guys? Like, get off my back. But if we are actually at a stage of contemplation, there's a problem, but I don't know if I'm going to do something about it. Versus preparation, there is a problem, I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to set a date, I'm going to prepare. And then the action stage is actually taking action. And that can be very uncomfortable, right? Whether that's outside of your comfort zone or not, it has to do with you making the call with your own readiness. But then also the fake it till you make it. If that's part of your action plan, go for it. I find it's better to kind of be with yourself. So I agree with everyone on that.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks. Next up is going to be Leah, followed by Priyanka. Leah.
Hi, I really enjoyed the breakout group. It's wonderful. Somebody made the point, just in, looking at all of us, that we were all different ages and different decades. And I think, and what I thought of was that, we're always changing. We don't have the same self-worth at, 25, 35, 45, 55, nor should we. And that the way that we see ourselves and others is dependent on where we are in the lifespan, and it's natural.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leah. Next up, everybody thinks that their breakout group is always the best. And they're all right. Next up is Priyanka. Priyanka, go ahead. You need to unmute yourself. Okay. All right. So if there is nobody else, let's see here. So I have a whole bunch of things that I have identified, but John, what are the themes that we say? Let's not go into any
Okay.
of the themes. Priyanka, you're ready? Okay, go
Yeah.
ahead, Priyanka.
Yeah, that's the exact point I made.
Mhm.
What Leah said, I
Mhm.
think. The person before me said.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you, Priyanka. Thanks.
I think it's funny. Yeah,
Thanks.
I think we were all different age groups.
Mhm.
And that like life is like it's like what did I say? Exactly. Help me.
That's fine. It'll come to you. We're going to
Help
talk
me.
about all these.
Run.
Yes, yes. We're going to talk about all of these things and it'll come to you. I'm going to summarize everything everybody said and it is going to come back. Thank you. So, John, I have listed a bunch of things that I have identified. What are the things that stand out for you?
Okay, so I have one idea of on the notion of faking it until we make it, but you have to make sequential progress, like definitively quantifiable, measure-sized. Okay, here I am. I'm definitively growing. You have to see yourself close the gap. I think that was a terminology established. Another
John, let me interrupt. Let's not go into answering the questions. Let's see, okay, what are the various questions you want to take up or topics you want to take up?
Okay, yeah. So how far, I would say, extracting a question from that, how far should this gap be?
Sure.
Of faking it, right? So that can be a principle.
Mhm.
There's still a lot of ambiguity in terms of what are some indicators that we're too far outside of our comfort zone. I don't think we really conclusively found any like concrete idiosyncrasies and like what to look out for. So I think that can also be something like from the question that we established, a second question, some indicators of stepping too far outside of our comfort zone. Another principle I have is, I guess a question could be, how can we comprehensively understand ourselves? Because it seems like that's a general principle that we should establish in terms of, okay, understanding our point A so we can contrast to point B. Self-acceptance, self-awareness, they all kind of underlie in this theme of how do we understand ourselves? How can we study ourselves? How can we gain self-awareness? I guess that can be a question.
Okay.
And then a principle, actually the other final principle was kind of related to the second question of how can we accurately assess our idiosyncrasies.
Sure. Let me do one thing. I'm going to summarize what kind of large issues I saw come from what everybody said. I'm not going to go person by person, but just general issues that came up. I mean, one of the big themes was growth mindset versus static mindset, of people holding kind of static mindset, saying, this is what I am, and that's it. And that shaping their self-worth, versus fake it until you make it versus being authentic. That was a very big issue of saying, okay, is it good? Is it right to fake it until you make it so that you grow into something? Or is it right to be authentic? What are the issues involved in that? People talked about self-reflection as being critical to this entire process. There was question of internal validation versus external validation, or to what extent should we depend on internal validation? To what extent do we need to listen to external validation as a hedge against our biases? So I think that's one thing. One idea, I think this was Mark, was the idea of compassion towards yourself as being one of the core approaches. And there was there was the take on reality, kind of actually trying to be real and trying to actually assess where you are and being okay with whatever answers you find. There was a distinction between, the question of distinction between self-worth and narcissism. There was a distinction between being kind of destructively selfish versus self-love, genuine self-love. There was a question of what role do stories we tell ourselves play in all of this? How does that shape our self-worth? How does it change over time? So it's just amazing stories. So, amazing range of things. So maybe let's tease this out, John, and see. So basically what we're trying to see is, how do we evaluate ourselves? What's a proper way of judging ourselves, which is real? I mean, let us take for granted, both of us and many in this group agree with some of the basic principles that we're trying to be real, in the sense that we are not trying to actually pretend to ourselves what we are not. We are trying to get at real things. Secondly, we are also committed to growth, in the sense that whatever we are right now, we're saying, oh, we can of course be better. And that's just given. So that those two principles, that we want to know where we are and to have a level of kind of self-awareness, self-acceptance of saying, this is where I am, no matter what I think, good or bad, actually saying, okay, this is where I am. If it is real, that's, so there is a value to that. Then there is a kind of almost like the issue of compassion towards ourselves, of saying, I have compassion towards myself, whatever it is, wherever I am, good, bad, ugly, but I have a basic compassion towards myself. Then there is the epistemological issue of everything that you're figuring out about yourself. How do you make sure that you don't get carried away? How do you make sure that you are not kind of biased? How can you use some feedback from reality, from your actions, as a corrective mechanism, as a supportive mechanism, to make sure that you remain tied to reality? So you're not transferring the responsibility of trying to understand yourself, but you are trying to get the external feedback and to make sure, and you're evaluating the person who is giving the feedback too, but to use that as a feedback, a real feedback, to make sure that, so these are some of the things. So how do you think about this? So John, let me ask you the questions, and then we can have people jump in. Okay, so first question, how do you judge yourself? How do you judge yourself for, John?
Okay, so I have a everybody's heard me talk about this more than a half a dozen times. I have an extremely comprehensive and meticulous self-analysis journal, a system that I've tracked every single day of my life since Sunday, March 22nd, 2015, where I extract patterns of my day. So an example of a pattern is, like, I ask myself at the end of every single day, what is something that I messed up today? What is something that I could have done better? Like, where could I have improved today? What did I do wrong, right? And what I did wrong, that's obviously the most room for growth. I also capture other things like my goals, my accomplishments, etc., but that's all tangential in value. And then once I have an entire year of this, that's a comprehensive dive, if I'm being honest with myself, which I do very, very much try to do that, because it's high in my value hierarchy, being honest. If I'm being honest with myself, I have all these unconscious patterns. I brought this up in I think it was in the main discussion group about, if I ask you how was your 2020? What's your biggest lesson that you're taking away from 2020? You might have this like surface level answer of like, oh, I think I need to do this. But if you look at it on paper, the paper is going to highlight and illuminate to you these unconscious beliefs. Because if I look at my microcosm of a one day, I can say, okay, I can get very specific. And then when I get very specific and I find that manifest in a multitude of ways, maybe 5, 10, 20 days out of the entire year, for me, that's a pattern. But that pattern is unconscious. It's not accessible to my overarching realm of, if you ask me, how was your year? I don't know. I have to look at my days. And then I can look at my days. I find patterns. I extrapolate these like beliefs behind the patterns, etc. Very comprehensive process.
Okay. Let me do this. The thing is that I know we have talked about this a lot. Okay. Mm-hmm. But the thing is that this is completely kind of part of you, this entire method. So you just zoom through it. Okay. But I want to break it up into parts. Okay. And actually talk about what are the elements that is making this work. Okay. That's fair. Because for somebody to understand it and use even a part of it, they have to do that. They have to kind of, so first part that I see, this is what I noticed. Okay. This is like an external observer looking at your system. And I'm saying, what are you doing? Okay, so first thing you're doing is that you're clearly identifying what you value, right? I mean, all in the diagrams that you have these 8 things or whatever, X number of things. You'll say, these are the things that matter to me. These are my values. And I'm going to measure myself on that. So that I see as a first step. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. So you say, okay, these are and this second part is that these 8 things or whatever, do you know the number? It is, you know the number. What is it? How many such things that you closely monitor?
Like realms of my life?
Yeah.
There are 7.
7. Okay. So 7, these 7 things, right? But these 7 things, basically, what is the property of these, right? So they cover all of your life. Okay. All of your life that you care about is captured in those 7 things, right? So that is the first thing. Now, remember that itself is an achievement of looking at your life and saying, what are the things that matter to me? And having that in clear terms. I have 5. Okay, so so each person has to formulate it in your own way that makes sense to you. Okay, so that's point number 1. The second point is the principle of measurement. Okay, you are actually going to measure, because most people kind of feel good about their values and they have a kind of an emotional evaluation of their values. Now, that's not wrong. I mean, you can have an emotional, but what the measurement does is that it makes things more precise. It doesn't let you fool yourself. And you're doing this. So one part is measurement, and second part, which is a corollary of measurement, is regular measurement. So it's like every day you are measuring where you are. So I think, so the measurement and commitment to regular measurement. So those are the second elements I see. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. The next thing is that you are measuring the extremes, right? You're measuring what really went wrong and what really went well. Okay. Yep. Because the way in which the human mind works is that it is able to see the extremes easily. So you're kind of leveraging the fact that our brain is a difference engine. The second thing, also, if you work on things that are going really wrong, it is going to help you a lot. Or if you identify things that are going really well, you may be able to leverage that a lot. So that's where most of the payoffs are. So does that make sense? So that's the other thing that you're doing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you're keeping the other part of it, which is kind of taken for granted here, but which is critical, is that this is all written. Okay. The fact that it is written is a very big deal. Why is it a big deal? Because it is external to you. You're taking a snapshot. Your mind is continuously active and it is doing all kinds of things. You're capturing everything down so you can go back and look at it tomorrow, an hour from now, a year from now. Okay. And then on the top of that, what you're saying is that you're looking at the patterns. Okay, how is this area doing? And you almost can see it growing or not growing. You can compare it to other areas. So these are the elements that I see in what you're saying. So now how do you measure self-worth using all of this?
Personally, I value this in terms of my congruence with those principles that I've established, right? So if I'm congruent with my beliefs, if I act on what I believe to be true, if I test the validity of my hypotheses in the world through bold action, through getting outside my comfort zone, if I explore my curiosities, if I express my desires, then I'm living congruent with the type of person that I know I want to become. I know I'm closing the gap between my point A and my desired ideal. And if I do something that betrays that, I get a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, a lot of like this conscience eating at me. And that's how I measure worth. If I'm consistent with my principles, if I'm consistently getting better. Also, as you said, the value of having it external, having it written, I can look at my life as a snapshot on paper. So my next year's lowest lows become the previous highs, if that makes sense. So I always want to be moving up, moving forward, getting better, improving, expanding, adapting. I never want to regress to where I was or lower, right? For me, that would elicit negative self-worth. I would have a lot of guilt with that. So if I'm moving forward in a positive direction towards my goals on paper and I can prove it to you, then I have personally a lot of self-worth and pride and confidence in that.
Wonderful. Let me try to put it in my own words. To again, because see, you kind of hold it in your mind in a as
Sure,
one
yeah.
unit, right? So I'm trying to break it up so people can see it, right? So one of the critical things that you said, and this was the point which was actually not really focused on in any of the comments, is that your self-worth is based on your principles. You have a certain principles, certain standards, which you say, this is what is good. This is what I want to be. And that you have in explicit terms. And you are measuring your self-worth against those principles. So can you give me a couple of examples, 2 or 3 principles that you measure yourself against?
Okay, perfect example. I actually just finished my annual review of last year, 2020, and I extracted some things that I need to, like some new, I guess, updated principles. I update them every single year. So the first thing is say what needs to be said. Okay, if I feel the need to express something, whether it's be uncomfortable, be vulnerable in a relationship, if there's an issue in a relationship or at work, career, whatever, I feel the need to say something, I have to say it. That's one of my principles. Similarly, is like ask what needs to be asked, right? Another one for me is be vulnerable in order to evolve. Another one is value adventure over security. Another one is run toward my fear. Okay, those are some important ones. I had a fifth one. I can't, blanking my mind right now, but those are some examples.
Okay,
of principles that I adhere to.
Yeah, this is great, because what principles do is that principles give you, principles are about how to act. See, that's the other point I want to make. You're actually measuring your actions all the time. So you're comparing your actions against the principles and say, did I do that? Did I run towards the fear? Did I pursue adventure today? Did I pursue adventure in this particular context? So I think having principles is critical. And that's something that's actually really the heart of what you're doing, kind of having those principles. And a lot of the work is, I mean, first we talked about kind of identifying the values against which you measure yourself. This is like identifying the virtues. So you have actually two-pronged measurement. There is a measurement of values, that which you're seeking. So it is like your ideal weight, your ideal strength, your financial, your relationship. So that's what you're seeking. And then in addition to that, you have principles, which are virtues, and you're measuring yourself. So it's a two-pronged measurement of values and virtues. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. All right. So I think this is very good. So this is so folks, if you have any questions about this, about measuring your self-worth. So now, see, this kind of makes a lot of these things. Now, let me apply some of these points that other people brought up, right? Static versus growth mindset. Okay. The beautiful thing about principles are these are the principles that actually allow you to grow, right? Seeking adventure, running towards fear, right? Saying what needs to be said. All of these allow you to grow. So it's kind of, it is growth mindset captured in those principles. The point about self-reflection, what you're doing is that you're doing actually, this is self-reflection on steroids, because you're continuously measuring yourself. And this is like a mirror, that whenever I look at something like this is like your mirror. This is what I was. This is like you're drawing a portrait of yourself, of your day, and saying, is that, and then you look at it another day, say, a year from now, you say, oh, that's what I was. So it is a way of self-reflection, and it is very powerful. It is kind of looking in the mirror, but a mirror which is designed to highlight the things that you care about, and only the things that you care about, if it can. How do you think compassion fits in this self-worth? Do you think
can you refine the question?
Sure. Do you think the question of the issue of compassion comes in? Are you compassionate with yourself, or you do not think about that as an issue?
Oh, okay. Personally, I think I'm very hard on myself, so I don't know how to answer that. But
all right,
I
you
do
don't
see
you
it as a
you
value.
you
I do see our relationships with ourselves being as a precedent for other relationships with people. So I do see that. All the people in my life, I tend to encourage them to grow. I tend to have, accountability. If they tell me something like in passing, like a New Year's goal, I'll randomly text them 3 months later and say, hey, how are you doing on this? Like out of nowhere. That's just because that's how I am with myself. So I think it is a precedent. I think it is a marker, but it's kind of like a tough love approach. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like you need to get it together, but I'm saying this because I appreciate you, because I
Yes.
want you to grow. I want you to, reveal your fullest self to the world.
What about this fake it until you make it? Do you use it at all or no?
I do. Yeah.
And
So
how?
going back, I think I said this in the primary discussion, my ideal is updated every 12 months because I think that's, for me, it's that ideal length. It's the perfect length for me because it's really motivating, but it's also attainable. It's very practical. So once I establish that ideal, I ask myself, okay, how does this person act? How does this person dress? How does this person present themselves? How does this person have conversations? What environments is this person in? What hobbies does this person do? All those things, and I try to do them as if I'm already that person, if that makes sense. I act as a future self every day of my life.
Wonderful. Let me look at one other last one. So this entire system is your own way of measuring yourself. How do you use feedback from other people, or do you use feedback at all? And under what circumstances you use it? And how does it relate to your own system of measuring self-worth?
Very good question. So I brought this up a little bit earlier in the main presentation, concluding statement, I believe, the concluding answer to the question. I will value feedback if I have a deep emotional connection with that person. So if I intimately know them over the course of several years, or if it's like a deep romantic relationship, et cetera, there's vulnerabilities there, right? There's a connection there. They can see parts of me that I might not be able to see. Or if it's like surface level, superficial feedback, I will value it if it's a pattern. If I hear it in multiple like iterations of that. If one person says one thing, especially if it's negative, especially if it's like criticism, I don't really care. In one ear, out the other. It's mainly projection. Even if it's not going to affect me, whatever. But if multiple people say it, I'm like, okay, I'm still not going to like react to it, but there might be merit there. There might be utility in that. And if 3 people say it, I'm like, okay, maybe there's something, might be projection. So it depends on the nature, if it's like criticism or praise, right? Or if it's like, if the advice was asked for, if it was warranted. I feel like if it's not warranted, it could often be projection, especially if it's criticism. So personally, I don't place that much like systematic of a value approach on terms of external feedback. I don't really ask for feedback much, as much as I think I should, but I have gotten a lot of valuable feedback. And in my analysis of like my memories of doing that, it's always been people I've deeply emotionally had a connection with. Or if it was the pattern, if a lot of people have said the same thing about me, I'm like, okay. And then maybe I found it in my patterns in my yearly review as well. I'm like, okay, it's there. You know what I mean? It's there. It's inside and outside. I know it has to be true. I have to analyze it.
Okay, folks, we have put a lot of interesting stuff on the table. Now, we don't have much time, but if you can ask a very quick, trenchant questions, you're welcome to do that. 1 to 2 sentences. You can go ahead and ask questions. Go ahead and type !! if you'd like to ask any question about this discussion on self-worth or measuring of self-worth. Okay, Joe, 1 to 2 sentences questions, please. Joe, go ahead.
So really, well, can I make a quick statement?
Sure, very quick.
All right. So
go ahead.
All right, I'll try and keep it to 3 sentences. It comes back to the idea of principles being able to be stated simply. So the question about compassion, if you think about it in the principle of justice, then it kind of takes care of itself. So the idea is to state it as simply as possible, and then you can live by that principle, and then the rest takes care of itself within it, underneath that. So that's the only thing I wanted to add, is that, and that's the importance why to really get it stated simply as possible. Wonderful. And that's why having 7 would be great. Sorry for all the sentences.
No, it was still very compact and a lot of meaning. I actually measure content per second. That's my measurement. So even if a person can, and people who can, like, for example, Shelley, right? She has so much things to say that I want her to do an entire meetup. Okay, but because the content per second is fantastic, and that's always the case with you, Joe. So wonderful, thank you. Next up is Manju, Jack, and Andrew. Try to be short, please. Manju.
Yes. Okay. So John, I was particularly struck by what you had said just a moment ago about how you I think play or take on the persona of your future self for self-improvement. So how do you recognize your future self being your real self in that process?
What exactly do you mean? How do I recognize him? What do you mean?
Well, I mean, if you are taking on the persona of being your future self,
mm-hmm.
daily basis, I believe that's what you said. What
mm-hmm.
you said, is that correct? That
mm-hmm.
you take on the persona of your future self. When does that future self that you take on become who you really are, instead of the future self being John, basically the real self in real time?
So in mathematics, it's known as an asymptote. It's something I will never reach because it's continually updates, of course. Like, I have become the ideal version of my future self I've established many times over, right? Of course, because every year I reset my goals. So it's something I'll never reach. It's something that is always a little bit ahead of me, but I'm always reaching for it. And that keeps me striving forward and forward and forward and forward. Nietzsche actually has a few quotes on this. He says, a great man, I merely see the play actor of his own ideal. So play actor, I've always loved that phrase. Speaking of like Shakespeare and plays, like you're acting as if you are this future person. He also says, he who does not know the way to his ideal lives more frivolously and impudently than the man with no ideal. So that's very interesting.
Wonderful. Next up is Jack, followed by Andrew. Jack, what's your question?
Mine's more of a suggestion than a question. Just
very quick though. Go ahead.
Yeah, from like for the ADHD folks, attach the why as you analyze your behavior, or attach the why to your goals and maybe post it in a place that you'll always look at, like your mirror or something. It helps you stay focused.
Wonderful, thank you. That's great tip, because it allows you to go one level deeper into saying why are you doing this? Is that, Jack? That's what it does, right? What does it do?
I think it helps with consistency too, because like, especially people with ADHD and just people who are really busy, you're easily distracted. So just having it like in your bathroom mirror or like on your door helps you stay focused on your goals.
Wonderful. I mean, one of the principles of thinking that I have found very useful, I call it going one level deeper. So no matter what answer you have, if you just go one level deeper, you are able to see something of why you're doing it. And it just gives you, completely new level of insights. Thanks, Jack. Next up is Andrew.
Yes, John, question for you. I also journal, and I'm curious to know, you do measurements basically. How do you do it? Do you have a scalar quantity, some kind of a quantitative methodology? How do you do it?
Okay, interesting question. The best approach to answer it shortly, in terms of quantitative, I track my disciplines that will get me closer to my ideal. Okay, so I work deductively through this ideal. Okay, this is the person I want to become in my health, wealth, relationships, career, romantic life, etc. I work deductively. Okay, what are some milestones? What are some gaps? What are some disciplines that I should do every day to close that gap? One simple one is like reading, exercise, meditation, etc. So then I say, okay, I should do these things every single day, 5 days a week. There's 260 something days in a year, weekdays there is. I track the weekdays for my discipline. So that's something I should do every day. By the end of the year, I can say, okay, I read a total of 260 out of 260 days. I got 100%. That's my report card for the year, if you will, right? I grade myself on all of these disciplines. I give myself a percentage. I also track in terms of health. It's a big value for me. I track my calories, carbohydrates, macros, protein, etc. That's all in terms of numbers. Now, in terms of qualitative, like values, like Shrikant was saying, it's kind of like a two-pronged fork. I track my performance in terms of what did I do wrong today, what did I learn today, what am I extracting from today, what was a pattern from today, what was the dominant thought of today, did I hit my goals today, etc. Those are a little bit more like conceptual. They're not really reducible to numbers, if that makes sense. But I guess those are two things that I pull out of every day.
Yeah. Wonderful. All right, folks, this is
Sure. Can I just follow that very quickly? I think that's actually the big challenge right there, is the things that are actually most, I'm going to call them, say, most important. It's very difficult to actually track your progress, because it's one thing to quantify your calories and how many reps and really make an improvement on that, but to be able to rate how well you did in the category of sticking with my values for the day, it's difficult. And then you wind up kind of being qualitative, and it's difficult to go back and really truly see the trend. So I was curious to know if you actually were able to quantify that on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I think the degree of certainty in your daily decisions is commensurate to the degree of like translucency you've established your ideal with. So the more clear you are on your ideal, the more clear your decisions should be. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that keeps coming up of saying, for example, take principles like run towards your fear, pursue adventure over security. How, like when you're looking at a day and say, okay, to what extent did I do this? How do you measure that?
So those are like overarching ones that I should do for this year. I extracted those particular 5 ones. By the way, the other one came to mind. It was have a bias for execution. Don't hesitate in anything. If I have an ideal, just execute on it. So those came from analyzing my 2020. Okay, those were patterns that I didn't do in 2020 as much as I wanted to do, and they would manifest in the way of like, oh, my lowest low of today was having an idea and not executing on it. Maybe I saw that like 5 or 10 times throughout the course of 2020, scattered throughout the year. And like I extracted that as a pattern, and then I'm saying, okay, here's a weakness in my character. Here's a flaw. I have to address it. So in short, I might not know until December of this year. You know what I mean? I might not really know unless I see it like manifesting itself repeatedly.
I think that's critical. I do that all the time. What it is that you're like making systematic observations about what you're doing based on whatever system you have. And then you look at the pattern in the whole, and you abstract a new principle out of that. And you're saying that if I focused on this particular aspect, like for example, for me, I would say, pay attention to the unknown, of, kind of relentlessly ask yourself, what is it that you don't know? And try to figure out what that could be, and just keep an eye out on that. So that's a principle that I was not doing earlier, but by looking at your own experience, you say, oh, if I did that, and then that becomes a guiding principle. So these principles are not fixed. Okay, so just like the growth mindset, you're expanding as a person. These principles are ways of actually accelerating your progress. And what principles will help you do that changes over time, because what happens is that these principles, by relentless practice, some of them become part of you. So you don't need to pay that much conscious attention to it, because that's kind of has become part of you. So you go to the next level principles, or kind of principles that you have not, that you may be missing. So it's a dynamic process. I thought that was very good. Mushki.
Yeah, I started to write it in the chat. Basically, I believe that the habits we engage in now create our ideal self. So I have a spreadsheet of 7 goals, such as socialize, meditation, exercise, etc. They're color-coded, and I fill out daily when I do it. And I write well done right after. And that well done is like reinforcement, like a reward, according to like learning psychology. And then I'm able to metricize it. I see every single day, after every week, after every month, after every year, how I'm doing, and I keep adding goals. And it took some time to figure out the exact habits that will create this ideal self, but it is possible to metricize it.
Yeah, I want to add one more thing to this. We did this when we studied Ray Dalio's method. So for example, he has this cycle that is cycle of growth, where you set ambitious goals. So that's step number, there are 5 steps. First is set ambitious goals. Second, identify the problems, face the problems that you're going to run into. Third, identify the root causes. 4, make a plan. And 5th, execute. Okay. So this is a cycle that you do when you're trying to grow, trying to achieve things. And you can evaluate yourself on how well you do on each of those 5 things. And you will find that you're actually, and you can have, I find using a scale of 1 to 4 as a good way, good, quick way. And you can tell whether you're really strong or really weak. You don't really need to know whether it is 89.4%, but you can tell whether you're doing a very good job or very poor job or somewhere in the middle. And that's a good enough precision. You shouldn't demand more precision than that is possible for a particular, in a particular context. Okay, so Betty, you had a question, go ahead.
I didn't have a question, I just had a point. I really like the idea that when you practice a principle, it becomes you, because I'm really seeing now that the whole idea of taking on the persona of the future self is that it's a process. So even though at the beginning, it feels like you're being not necessarily genuine because you're faking it till you're making it, but as we get step closer and see it's a process, I think that it's a journey.
Wonderful. Thank you, Betty. Mark.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was up that quickly. Yeah, I just put it in the chat. I just want to follow up on this thing about the difference between things that you can track with metrics like reps and calories and stuff, and the things that are much more challenging, like practicing compassion, for example, or moving towards a specific goal. And I just wanted to call out the value of mindfulness. Like I find just that practice of throughout the day, just stopping and looking inside and just feeling like, am I feeling comfortable about what's been going on or not? And if I'm not feeling comfortable, why not? And I tend to find out if I'm not feeling comfortable, it's because I behaved in a way I didn't want to behave. It wasn't compatible with the values I'm trying to promote in myself. So I think that I recommend that sort of approach for people, for those grayer things. Just stop throughout the day. That thing about waiting to the end of the day and writing it and journaling it later, my memory is not good enough. I have to do it throughout the day more spontaneously.
Wonderful. Next up is Becky.
I just want to make a quick comment about measuring metrics. And so there are 2 ways of measuring metrics. One would be like a lead metric, very superficial, easy thing to measure. For example, the number of times you do something. But then what you're really trying to get at is the lag metric, which are your ultimate results, things that come after you try to increase your lead metric, something you can tangibly measure. And as a result, you really get that lag metric that comes later on that you can't measure up front.
Excellent. Excellent point. John, any last words, and can you tell us what you're planning to do? Do you know what you're going to do 2 weeks from today?
I have a slight inclination. I'm going to do something with observation and or awareness with using Huxley's Island.
Okay,
Probably.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And next Friday, we're going to be talking about the importance of knowing yourself and how knowing yourself enables you to fight fear so that you can pursue your values. All right, so that's coming up next Friday. All right, thank you very much, everybody. This is delightful as always, and fantastic comments. And thanks, John. That was great. See ya.
Take care.
Bye.